Thank you very much for the warm welcome and for this invitation and a chance to be together with you to discuss a common and very complicated problem, which is the how to do part that you just mentioned. We have a known crisis globally, a crisis that has been variously called the crisis of sustainable development, or the crisis of the Anthropocene, or the crisis of planetary boundaries. We've known about this crisis for many decades now, and we can't seem to reach the critical stage of action. And I want to reflect a bit about that and open it up for discussion and brainstorming, because we're in a room with Professor Goldenberg alone would be enough to have a thorough discussion of the politics and reality of this issue. There are many, many experts, Gilberto and many experts all through this audience, or not audience, our group brainstorming, to address this practical problem. It was 45 years ago that the world held its first summit on this challenge in Stockholm, the conference on the human environment. And that was probably the first time at a diplomatic level that governments acknowledged that there was a potential crisis of economic development and physical earth processes. The term sustainability was not yet used, but the sense that there was a crisis was certainly present. It was also the year I entered university, and one of the first books I was given was Limits to Growth, which was the first bestseller on this topic. And I'll never forget my economics professor explaining to me after we read it, don't worry about it, it's not really a problem. She had two arguments. One was that the model had left out prices, and once you put prices in the model, scarce commodities would rise in price, and then we would substitute to less scarce commodities, and there would be induced innovation. So don't really worry about it. The other reason was that we were at Harvard and the authors were at MIT. Don't worry about it. What do they know about these things? And so I really left university not very concerned and not well educated. I would say on these issues, the subject of resource economics did not loom large. Even though we had gone through what I ended up doing my dissertation on, the oil price increases of the 1970s, it was not seen to be a physical shortage so much as a political shortage of oil, and those two episodes in 1973 and 1979. And so the physical earth and economics continued to go their very, very different way for most of mainstream economics. The world met again 20 years later in Rio, of course, and the Rio Earth Summit was understood at the time as the fundamental breakthrough because it was a remarkable accomplishment. Three major international treaties agreed in the context of the Rio Earth Summit: the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, all associated with the Rio Earth Summit. And the concept of sustainable development put into international law for the first time following the Brundtland Commission work of 1987. And Agenda 21, which would tell us what to do and how to move forward, with a pretty thick compendium of the what to do's. If you fast forward 20 years from 1992 to 2012, I wasn't at the Earth Summit in 1992, but I was at the Earth Summit as the Secretary General's advisor on economic development and the Millennium Development Goals in 2012. And I'm sure many of you were there as well. It was a very somber meeting because the overwhelming conclusion was nothing really had changed in the world of solving problems. Agenda 21 completely disappeared from sight, except, I think it's right to say, except in Sweden, which does everything right. But almost no place else would even know that it existed by 2012. It was not part of our reality of policy, politics, action, agenda, and the grade that Nature magazine gave to the 3 Rio treaties in a spread in 2012, 3 failing grades because the 3 treaties had not been implemented at all, I think was a fair judgment. Of course, from 1992, China had another remarkable growth spurt, and so global emissions accelerated dramatically. The Kyoto Protocol had failed because the United States went into a funk, which I will talk about. We're now in a worse one, but we went into a highly political funk. The US had never ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, by the way, because one of our leading lights of politics of the time, Newt Gingrich, convinced the Congress that landowners had the natural right to destroy any species they want as long as it was on their land. And it was a violation of property rights to enter into an agreement like the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, I think, is probably the least known treaty that I know of in the UN system, even though the topic that it engages, land degradation in the dryland regions of the world, is absolutely one of the most important practical challenges of war and peace across a stretch of 10,000 kilometers from West Africa to Afghanistan. But the treaty itself is almost completely unknown. And even in the middle of UN policy circles, can go 2 or 3 years without hearing it mentioned once. It has no presence and no power. So it was in 2012 that in this rather dreary and dreadful mood that governments asked again, what shall we do? And the idea was raised here to adopt sustainable development goals that could provide a more public awareness that would take the challenges outside of diplomacy and international law, and the idea was to put them in front of the world's public and in front of the world's governments in a much more direct way. I think it's an excellent idea, but the point I want to make today is that it could easily suffer the same fate as Agenda 21 and all the rest. We have not succeeded yet in a serious way in turning high-minded and scientifically correct and vital ideas into global action. It remains an absolutely profound and essentially unsolved problem of politics, governance, policy that is absolutely urgent. I don't think I have to spend much time on why it's urgent that we fulfill the 2015 agreement, which came after 3 years of negotiation at the UN. And I can tell you that those negotiations were more intense, more interesting, more engaged than almost anything I've seen at the UN in the last 20 years. And seeing a lot of practice, there was, on the good side, a tremendous interest in what would be the Sustainable Development Goals. We ended up with 17, which is a lot. If Moses had come down the mountain with 17, he probably would have been told, go back up the mountain and renegotiate. You would have had 3.5 tablets, and it would have been even harder to comply than even the 10, which we're not so good at. But the governments came up with 17, and they asked for some understanding and forgiveness because they had started with 300 proposed goals in the first canvassing of the 193 member states when governments were asked what should be our goals. And a very long list was made, and the 3 years was paring the list down to the 17. The 17 are absolutely meritorious objectives. Let me say that at the start. They embrace the 3 core pillars of sustainable development, meaning the economic challenge, the social inclusion challenge, and the environmental challenge. Broadly speaking, the first 9 of the goals are about economics. Not strictly speaking, there's a bit of overlap, and these 3 pillars are divided in different ways in different minds. But the beginning goals say to end poverty, to end hunger, to ensure universal access to health and to education, SDGs 3 and 4. SDG 6 is universal access to safe water and sanitation. SDG 7 is universal access to modern energy services with a strong emphasis on renewable energy. SDG 8 is decent work. SDG 9 is sustainable infrastructure. SDG 5, which I skipped over, I put with this second pillar of social inclusion, it's gender equality. And SDG 10 is reduce income inequality. And SDG 16 I often group in that social dimension. It's for peaceful and inclusive societies. And then the goals 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 are broadly speaking the environmental objectives. Sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production, mostly industrial ecology, waste management, recycling of materials. SDG 13 is the goal on climate change. SDG 14 and 15 are conservation of the marine and the terrestrial ecosystems. And that leaves one more goal, SDG 17, which is the goal, broadly speaking, of international partnership to achieve sustainable development. It's not a bad list, not at all. It's actually quite a good list. It has, for each of these goals, roughly 10 targets. And the targets also make sense. There are too many of them, many too many of them, and certainly not all targets apply to all countries, so the targets are more a pick and choose, but the 17 goals really are hard to see what you would drop off out of that list and still have a coherent, sustainable development agenda. SDG 13, I should mention, is on climate change, and there was one puzzle for the negotiators, which is how to have sustainable development goals, but make clear that global governance of the goals remains with the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the basic way that that was done was with an asterisk after SDG 13, which said that the goal of controlling climate change is what will be agreed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So SDG 13 incorporates the Paris Climate Agreement. My challenge and question to you, and my job description for the Secretary General, is how to make these real. Not just nice ideas. They are wonderful ideas, by the way. Just like our major multilateral environmental agreements, the 3 treaties I mentioned are wonderful treaties. I teach them each year, students read them, they're all coherent, they make sense, there's nothing embarrassing in what's agreed, they just aren't implemented. And the question for me in very practical terms is, how do you take an agreement like this and do something to make it real on a global scale? And is it worth it? Or is this just UN show business, and not very good show business, of course, because the UN's not so good at show business. So is this just a UN moment? They have to say something, let them say it, but now we're back to the real world, and the real world is obviously quite different. Clearly, there are people who take that view. I subscribe to a different view, which is has 2 motivations. One is, we absolutely, urgently have to do this. This is not a option. And the reason it's not an option is that the environmental challenge is different from almost every other human challenge that we know, which is that for most challenges, and I'd even say ending poverty, which is dear to my heart, is a more normal challenge. It could happen now, it could happen later. We should hurry it because that's the moral and right thing to do. The slower we go, the more people suffer, the more people die. But if it's delayed, which tragically it is delayed because our attention span is not good, it doesn't preclude achieving the goal later on. Whereas when it comes to the environmental crises, we are facing irreversibilities and sharp nonlinearities. So we are absolutely at risk of wrecking ecosystems all over the world. We are at risk of making fundamental and irreversible changes to the climate system, very close indeed. And according to my brilliant, wonderful, pessimistic, and terrifying colleague, James Hansen, we're already there. He scares me every time I talk to him because basically he always tells me, Jeff, it's much worse than you think. It's much more advanced than you think. And when we left Paris in 2012, I went to a press conference to say how wonderful the agreement was, and Jim Hansen went to a press conference to denounce it as another fraud on humanity by saying too little, too late, misunderstanding of the urgency. And if you have Hansen as one guru and your other guru is E.O. Wilson, who was my colleague at Harvard for 30 years and a beloved guide to me, he will tell you in graphic terms, of course, of how we're losing in the very last stages of killing more than 1 million, possibly several million species. And they will also not come back, despite Jurassic Park, despite whatever we think about paleo resurrection. We're losing ecosystems in an irreversible way. So the environmental crisis, I said, is different because it is irreversible. It's closer to the nuclear war threat. You don't get two chances, you better solve it, and we're not solving it. And the other reason I take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously is that, in my view, there is no other way to achieve the objective of combining economic well-being and environmental sustainability other than through a global goal, other than through a global process. Not only because the challenge is global, but because our ability to do things is so do things together is so weak and so fraught with disturbance and inattention that we need absolutely, as fragile as it is, devices of convergence, of understanding, of viewpoint, of timelines, of commitments, partly to solve incentive problems, after all, because all of this is a tragedy of the commons writ large, but partly to be able to keep attention on the urgency of these issues. So if you think it's hard to make people interested in the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's nearly impossible, I would say think how hard it would be to have no goals globally agreed and be a prophet of doom on a street corner, yes, but not having practical inroads at all. So I believe that having this rare, very rare fact of unanimity, universal adoption of these goals, albeit by an earlier government than the one we have now in the United States. But they haven't denounced the goals. They just have no idea. So keep it a secret in Washington. They won't do damage. They won't know about them. But for most of the rest of the world, the Sustainable Development Goals have a real life, but a very fragile one, a very weak pulse. But it still is a pulse. Yesterday I was in Buenos Aires with the senior officials planning Argentina's presidency of the G20, which begins this December. And most of my questions were about the role of the SDGs in the G20 agenda, which is not automatic to begin with because the G20 began as a finance ministers group. Now it's a head of state group. But the point I would say is, out of the discussions, it's absolutely clear that the Sustainable Development Goals are the only knitting that the G20 has for these issues. They're still dealing with macroeconomics and global financial markets and many other issues that are not really this agenda. But when they turn to this agenda on work, on gender, on infrastructure, on climate, though they don't want to use the word because it might upset one of the presidents, believe it or not. They will use the word somehow. But it does become the SDG framework that is the natural way to discuss these issues when heads of state meet. So we have a framework to 2030, and the question on my mind from morning till night is how to make it known and operational and ultimately successful, and how to avoid, on the one hand, the fate of Agenda 21, which basically disappeared entirely from sight. When I joined the UN in 2000, I never heard about it once, though I was the special advisor on the Millennium Development Goals to the Secretary General. There was no intersection at all. And we can't even afford, though it's the most likely outcome, the MDG outcome, which is that the Millennium Development Goals, which were goals between 2000 and 2015 to fight extreme poverty, did some good, but fell far short of the objectives that were stated. I can tell you they did a lot of good in that there are demonstrably lives saved, initiatives taken, new funds created, new institutions created that would not be there but for the global agreement reached in 2000. So they did that. But it was a very hard battle to keep any attention on that, especially we had 9/11 the next year. The United States then went into nonstop war, which we remain in nonstop war to this day. And that's an attention distractor. Not that the US was too deeply interested anyway, but it became almost completely outside of that issue. Unfortunately, with climate, we can't afford that. And yet we have the case of course, of Mr. Trump announcing the intention of the US to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So let me give you a little bit of diagnosis of a kind of theory of change that I would propose as being relevant for trying to turn this fragile but absolutely urgent and necessary agenda. And here, this is not preaching to a choir, this is preaching to leaders of it. What do we do to actually have the critical effect that we have not yet been able to achieve? I think we have to understand what this battle is about and what makes it extraordinarily difficult. And several elements to that I want to highlight briefly. One is a very direct, obvious, powerful one that should not be underestimated, and that is the sheer momentum of the world economy. And I don't mean this may sound a trivial observation, but the world does things in certain ways because that's how our institutions, our businesses, our teaching, our knowledge base are oriented. And the world economy is an absolute juggernaut. Maybe it doesn't feel like a juggernaut sometimes because there's a recession or slow growth, but globally it's a juggernaut. It's $125 trillion of output per year. It grows pretty reliably at 3 to 4% per annum. There are hiccups like in 2008 and 9, but growth is not a big problem worldwide. And growth at that scale is terrifying from the point of view of the environmental challenges. The global growth is neither fair, kind, inclusive, nor environmentally sustainable. But it is powerful. And when something grows at 3% per year, remember, you have a 23-year doubling time. And when something grows at 4% per year, you have an 18-year doubling time. And so every generation, we're going to have a $250 trillion output in 20 years. And we're already grotesquely unsustainable in practices, resource use, water management, carbon emissions, and 100 other aspects. So the sheer juggernaut of the world is powerful, and absolutely nobody's in charge. This is another point about the inertia. There are no leaders in the world. And the world economy is a self-organizing process to a very important extent. A second point that is quite obvious is that there are powerful vested interests that want to keep certain aspects of the agenda intact. And certainly the most powerful vested interests in the world are the fossil fuel industry, which brought us to the world economy that we have today. In the 20th century, the oil industry was politically the most powerful industry in the United States, I would dare say in Brazil, and in many other parts of the world. Oil has been the occasion for many wars. It's an amazing industry. It will go anywhere, to the deep sea, to the middle of the jungle, to the top of any mountain, to the Arctic, to pump oil. Amazingly competent industry. So competent it can absolutely destroy the world because it's relentless and it doesn't stop, and it happens in the United States to own most of the Republican Party, which is why we have the announcement that we've had. Trump didn't think of this by himself. He didn't think of almost anything by himself. He was instructed by the Republican leadership to pull out of Paris. An interesting letter by 22 senators the week before Trump's announcement is a who's who's list of who's funded by the oil industry in the United States. So it's not even hard to see all of the strings that are being pulled. But this is an absolute phenomenon, and every government I visit, to some extent, faces it. So Germany, which is as green as can be, can't shake the lignite. The United States is a petrostate. Brazil, maybe you're a petrostate, I don't know. But certainly Petrobras plays its role politically here in a very, very powerful way. In Argentina, the government's completely determined to be sustainable, but a little fracking wouldn't hurt too. And so maybe sustainability light. And around the world, this politics is very powerful. India, solar power, but not before we double coal production. Literally. We don't have a carbon budget left to accommodate this kind of gradualism. And as I'm sure you noticed, last week, the latest figures on carbon emissions came out, albeit the estimates for 2017. And they showed it's not gradualism, it bumped up again after thinking that we had plateaued, up 2%. And of course, CO2 up 3.3 parts per million, probably because of natural feedbacks, natural sinks turning into natural sources, perhaps the Amazon itself and that pulse of CO2. So that's the second point. But there's a third extremely important point as well. And that is that the transformations that are needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals are deep. And they're not simple. And they're interconnected. And they are not understood by any government. Neither the pace, the depth, the technical specifications, almost no place in the world has modeled what it takes to actually achieve the 17 goals. And this, I feel, is where the scientific community is urgently needed. Of course, the scientific community has played already the pivotal role to say we have a problem. Without the science, we would go on our merry way and destroy the planet without even knowing it. So the science of Earth systems, the science of greenhouse gases, the science of biodiversity and relation to land use, biogeography, already a fundamental role, because there is nothing evident that would let a layman like me even know the Earth is warming or that the biodiversity is being lost, but for the fundamental role of understanding the scientific processes, the monitoring, the measurement, the causal pathways. So that all needs to continue. But what we don't have is a science of transformation that is at all adequate. And there, one part of it is a bit of a confusion, I think, because it's not the role of the natural scientists by and large. It's mostly, in my opinion, the role of the engineers, actually. And then upstream to basic sciences, and downstream to lower levels like economics and policy sciences and behavioral sciences. It's a value chain, of course. But I do put the engineer as crucial in this because I regard this as overwhelmingly an engineering challenge. And that may make it sound, it could sound utterly naive or technocratic or scientistic or just wrong. But my view is with 7.5 billion people who need water every day, safe water, who need food every day, who actually want a job and to survive every day, who need to be able to cure a mosquito bite if it's carrying Plasmodium falciparum, and many thousands of other things need systems, not wishful thinking and not idealism of an earlier day, and not self-generated local behavior, which I find as a very attractive but false idea largely. While small is beautiful, I don't think small per se is the right definition for the changes we need, given the scale of the problem, the urgency of the problem, and the sheer scale of humanity and what that implies. So I view it as a systems engineering problem overwhelmingly. And when I think about it, I think of 5 major transformation categories. So I'll take you from 17 to 5 quickly. One is the energy transformation, and that is to decarbonize the energy system by 2050. And that is in a fossil fuel made world where 80+% of our primary energy is coal, oil, and gas. And if you take seriously the Paris climate goals, and if you have Jim Hansen as a colleague, you do even more, we should be out of fossil fuels by 2050. Of course, almost unimaginable, it sounds even nutty to say it, but that is the literal carbon budget to have a likely chance of achieving the Paris targets. It's dreadful. This is not a situation we want to be in. But that's transformation number 1. Transformation number 2 is sustainable land use. Because our second crisis is the one that Thomas Malthus talked about in 1798, and that is the sustainability of the food supply for the world. And Malthus's argument that every time there's a productivity gain, there will be a population gain to undo the productivity gain. Well, that aspect of Malthus was not correct, but Malthus was correct that productivity would be followed by population, and we've had a 9-fold growth of world population since Malthus wrote The Principles of Population. We're at 7.5 billion, rising 80 million per year. We'll reach 8 billion by 2022, 2023. We'll reach 9 billion by 2040 on the current trajectory. We'll reach 11 billion by the end of the century. And producing food in a sustainable manner for this world population is an unsolved problem, utterly unsolved. And Brazil is one of the world's leading protagonists in that challenge? Can Brazil be a world breadbasket and environmentally sustainable at the same time? It's an open question. It's an absolutely vital question. Same is true of every one of the breadbaskets. Argentina, where I was yesterday, the United States, which is depleting our main aquifer, the Ogallala Reservoir, at a shocking rate that we never talk about even one moment in the United States. The Indo-Gangetic Plains, North China. This is a global crisis added in piquancy by the fact that, of course, the current way we produce food is the leading anthropogenic forcing on the planet, more than the energy sector. The food sector releases more greenhouse gases. The food sector is responsible, of course, for the water crisis. Overwhelmingly, the food sector is responsible for the land degradation. The food sector is responsible for the habitat loss, for the species extinction, for the chemical pollutants, more than any other sector. So that's transformation number 2. Transformation number 3 is sustainable cities, which is the challenge of adding another 3 billion people in the world to cities in a way which is not devastating for the quality of life of those people and is inclusive, sustainable, and productive. Wonderful challenge. And there, the kind of engineering we need is city planning, architecture, landscape management, and all of the design features of transport, energy, water systems, and so forth. Those skills do not exist in a lot of the poorer countries. And so the challenge of making cities sustainable is an enormous practical challenge and design challenge. And making them zero carbon cities is, of course, part of the goal. So it needs to be sustainable in the way that will enable us to meet that first transformation. That's okay. Cities could be all electric, run on a 100% zero carbon energy supply, and all transport, I believe, will be I believe all transport will be electric, except maybe Brazil's niche in biofuels. But we're going to go basically to electric transport, both public and private transport, and cities need to be revamped for that. I'm a co-chair of an advisory board for the mayor of New York City on this. Very sophisticated city, by the way, like this one. Lots of very smart people. The plan doesn't exist yet, though there's a lot of work on making such a plan. Well, we need to have that plan made 500 times or 1,000 times around the world in a very practical way. The fourth transformation, which I think is probably the easiest of them, but not so easy and crucially important and unfulfilled, is the transformation to quality public services, especially health and education. The education systems around the world are bad, unfortunately, right now. And we're learning how bad they are. And kids are not learning. And when they graduate high school, they can't read. They don't know math. And this is true in many sophisticated, high-income countries, but it's tragically true in low-income countries. And in sub-Saharan Africa, only a quarter of the kids are completing secondary education right now. SDG 4 says that should be 100% by 2030. Is it feasible? If we put our mind to it, it's easier than the moonshot, which was an 8-year job. But of course, we don't put our mind to it at all. And the governments in Africa, aside from all of the other things one might say, can't afford to do this on their own. So they need partners that don't exist right now adequately. The amount of aid from all the world going to African secondary education, if I remember correctly, it's a few dollars per student per year. Nothing that could be transformative. And so this is the fourth transformation. Healthcare systems actually now have a good design. Education systems do not. Information technology should allow us to make wonderful advances pedagogically, in training, in outreach, in curriculum, but it's a public good. Private schools will do it for 5% of the children in the world, but for the other 95%, that's a public good that is not getting attended to. And the fifth transformation that I would emphasize is a general transformation of societies. I think it's obviously crucial for Brazil and for the United States, is to create the institutions for innovation itself, because we are in a period where we need massive technological change. We need to be training both expertise in those changes, enabling the both market and non-market realization of those changes, and helping society to cope with changes which are very large. And so in this sense, an innovation society is a kind of creation. In the United States, we have it in a few places. It's certainly not a general pattern in the United States. It's mainly the places that voted for Hillary Clinton and that did not vote for Donald Trump, almost literally. If you map who innovates and where the vote went, we have two countries. We have California, New York, Kendall Square between Harvard and MIT, the Research Triangle of North Carolina, and a few other pockets like that. And then we have a lot of places that don't innovate, that are jobless, that skills are not right, and that are in a fulminant populist revolt right now. So they've given the keys of the government over to a billionaire psychopath who is out to do them damage. I'm using only technical terms, by the way. This is not a political talk. I'm only referring to what many clinical psychologists have concluded about our president. Truly, by the way. You've noticed, but it's actually a scientific judgment that I'm making. So Brazil, here we are at a center of innovation, but the culture of innovation more broadly is not easy to instill, not easy to make. And in the economy today, without it, countries will not be able to thrive. Jobs will disappear. There will not be employment for high school graduates, and business will be dependent on driving Chinese electric vehicles and putting your identity to Google and many other things, and that kind of dependency for the world is not at all good. So I believe these are the five transformations that are needed. My experience in speaking with hundreds of ministers around the world in governments is that there is an open receptivity at a quite high level in most places. Actually, if I had to rank the vested interest problem versus the what to do problem, I would put the what to do problem as the larger barrier that we face. I actually believe we're going to beat ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers and Chevron. It's going to take a little bit of time, but they're losing, actually. And I was felt I used to be invited by Jeff Immelt to speak to GE events about climate change. A few years ago, not so much. He went back into fossil fuels in a big way in GE. The share price, he's gone now, and the share price is down more than 30% because you can't make a living on the old industry. So Trump will not resurrect coal, not for a moment. Oil and gas are going to be phased out. The drama is how fast, not whether it's going to happen. And that's why the irreversibility makes it a distinctive problem, because we don't want runaway climate change. We don't want all the horrors of living with 450 or 475 or 500 ppm CO2. And that's the drama, is the timing, not the will it happen. But the question of how to do something so different from the mainstream of normal development is a huge challenge. And as a development economist, I can say, I think fairly, that the essence of economic development for the last 200 years has been what the Japanese called the flying geese model, which was that there's a goose in front, and then the next two are following along in formation, and then the ones behind. And you don't have to understand too much, you have to follow the one in front of you. And so Britain went first, and then the US and Germany came next, and Japan, and so on and so forth. And you knew what development meant. Development meant a certain direction because you could already see that development in front of your eyes. And a very nice expression by a science fiction writer, William Gibson, that I like, who says the future is already here, but unevenly. And with development, that was certainly the case, that you could see what the future looks like, and you just were working towards that. That's no longer possible. What is Indonesia to do? What is India's new growth model? What is a good growth model for Uganda? You don't have an off-the-shelf answer anymore, because all the geese have to change direction. And the ones that were in front are far down the wrong path. So you don't want to follow the US example by any means. You don't want car-based CO2 emitting 16 ton per capita per year emission economies. You need to do something quite different. And so that's where the real challenge, to my mind, comes in. And of course, all of this is with a range of poorly understood choices, big unknowns. How do you run an energy grid on a high penetration of intermittent energy? What kind of storage technologies? Is there a role for carbon capture and storage? Is there still a hydrogen economy to speak of? What is the role of biofuels? These are all absolutely valid questions, and they need to be sorted out by governments that are not equipped to sort them out. And so I'll just end here by saying that aside from all the normal politics, we have a very deep, practical challenge, which is a pathways challenge, which is to understand what are options in a complex, dynamic, nonlinear, globally interconnected economy. What is a proper staging that leaves open choices, that invests in R&D, that roadmaps technologies in appropriate ways? Of course, I haven't said much about behavioral change. There is behavioral change at the individual level that's important, but maybe some of the biggest behavioral change is in governance. Governments cannot operate the way they do, and politics cannot operate on the model that it operates. The Western democratic model of politics as simply the competition for power at elections is a completely inadequate vision of politics for sustainable development. The model of a market economy is a completely inadequate model. Markets will still play a role, but we are absolutely in an age of planning. This is, without question, you cannot use market forces for this. You cannot let market forces determine this transformation. This is a planning problem, which is an anathema, by the way, in my country. If I said it, they'd almost lock me up. But this is absolutely correct, and it's why China is actually making real progress right now. Of course, from a pretty deep hole environmentally, but China does know how to plan. And this is a planning problem that is a quite significant planning problem. It doesn't mean central planning, it means planning a technological transformation that leaves as much open to learning and identification and even market forces, but gets the job done in a time-bound way. And that requires a lot of determination and planning. So that's my main message, is we have a lot of work to do. I believe we need to privilege the engineers in a certain way. This is a design problem, and it is a systems problem. And it is, of course, I've mentioned 5 interconnected systems that need significant change. Governments need to be able to process this, because this is not something that can be done without government, but it is something in which the current functions are not adequate. And I believe, in closing, that research institutions and universities have a unique responsibility in this challenge that is even beyond the normal statement that universities must play a constructive social role. It's something much more programmatic than that, in my view, which is that universities need to design their own activities to be able to give constructive, practical direction and answers to these problems in timing, quantification, specification, research investigation, monitoring, evaluation, metrics, learning, as a practical program for educational design and for organizing university activities. I was lucky to head an interdisciplinary center for 15 years, the Earth Institute, and really lucky that Columbia University early in the new century said that it would put money into that and organize around a thematic approach of sustainable development rather than a departmental approach. You can imagine how upset the departments were, by the way, and how suspicious they were of it till today. But it took a long time to teach all the wonderful scientists and engineers and policy types and political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, economists, law specialists, business specialists to talk with each other. And this kind of transformation requires that kind of agenda. And so I would say to the universities, we have to do this, and we have to reorganize our own activities in order to be able to do it well. Thank you very much. Thank you. The first 3 questions were about people, and I really welcome that, and of course, and said that the whole thrust of the Sustainable Development Goals was to bring these ideas to people and out of the rooms of negotiators. So there's no doubt that this is correct. It's very hard, by the way. It's extremely hard, not only because a dialogue of any individual is hard. But because, again, the scale and the urgency of the challenge is very, very hard. I often look at where the attention span is in the world by, for instance, the Twitter followers. So you can look up every day who has the big Twitter following. And it's worth looking at the top 100 followers on Twitter. About 96% are rock stars. Some athletes. Katy Perry's number one with, I don't know what it is now, but last time I looked it was 110 million followers. Justin Bieber and many other names. The Pope is not a tenth of that, but maybe a fifth of that. He's got a lot of followers. Obama is the only serious political figure in the top 10 in the world because he has something like 90 million. But if you take that even roughly as where the attention is, boy, it sure is not on these issues. This is for sure. And I think that is a very real issue. One solution to that that's an absolutely serious solution is to have Katy Perry tweet about the Sustainable Development Goals. And we should be doing systematically a lot more about that. And there are some wonderful, very practical movements like Global Citizens, which every September brings 70,000 people to the Great Lawn of Central Park for a rock concert that is actually a SDG seminar interspersed with the big name rock stars. And it works for those 70,000, and then it's picked up around the world. And I mention this because it's a tactic, actually. It is a tactic for making these things known. Another tactic is that children should learn this in school. And children's books from the first grade should talk about the earth and other species and weather and climate, and by fourth grade to learn about the climate of your own neighborhood, and by seventh grade to learn about climate, global warming, and so on. And of course, it would be the most wonderful curriculum, by the way. Every time I worked a lot in rural Africa during the past 15 years, and the curriculum is from the British 60 years ago, from the last decades of the colonial period. And yet you look out the goats and the sheep and the plants and the biodiversity and the weather and the dry seasons. It's the most wonderful teaching environment you could imagine ever. And yet it's disconnected completely from the curriculum. Oh, okay, so this is another part of this. Another part of this is that the SDGs should be undertaken in communities and at the city level. So SDG 11 is city sustainability. I was 2 days ago in Rosario, Buenos Aires, where wonderful mayor held a whole day on the Sustainable Development Goals for Rosario. Then I was with the deputy mayor of Buenos Aires yesterday, who was a student of mine at Harvard 20 years ago. And they're putting the SDGs literally into their planning apparatus. In New York, we're doing the same thing. Of course, we should have public gatherings, public engagements, discussions. What should the goals be of our community and our cities? This is what Aristotle wrote about when he talked about life in the polis, that's what a citizen does. Of course, at the time of the Aristotelian polis, you had a few thousand people who could aggregate at the Acropolis and talk with each other. And how do we do this in a mass age? It could be done, replicated all over the world, but how do we actually bring that about? If you have ideas, we need to do that completely. We really need to do this. It's extremely difficult. Another part of this is Pope Francis, who has played as big a role as any person in the world on making these ideas known in recent years. His encyclical Laudato Si is a wonderful document, really a beautiful document, and scientifically accurate, wonderfully inspiring. And I work a lot with the Vatican on encouraging across many religions actually to teach Laudato Si, because it's not a Catholic document per se, it's a world document. And using congregations, churches, parishes to get this out. In the United States, by the way, we have such conservative Catholic bishops in some places that there's resistance to this agenda. What's the Pope doing talking about climate change? If you can imagine. But by and large, this is well accepted. So I'm a huge fan of this. And I also don't mean to sound crazy technocratic of saying the engineers have this unique role that I said, but it is also really true that the challenge of safe water every day, adequate food and nutrition every day, transport, public health delivery, and so on, is also a huge systems issue. And we need training and systems delivery and the capacity to do this. All of this operates at almost no budget, by the way. The UN, there's no budget for any of this. So from a UN point of view, I beg for a living because there's no way to even do the smallest things without begging, basically. That's life, that's Darwinian life, but it's very dangerous because you would like to think that there would be a properly large funded effort to help get the word out. It doesn't exist. And any billionaires that want to contribute to that, it's small for them and huge for the world. And I'm about to launch actually a kind of billionaires call for the SDGs, because this is also something unbelievable. 2,000 people have a net worth of $8 trillion right now. 2,000 people, 4 billion a person on average. And so if a few of them would get together in a really coherent way, this could make a phenomenal difference as well. So we're going to try that approach as well. And then so many other things that one could say about how the deeper human questions that you're asking also about how can people join the agenda, what can inspire them, how can they learn and participate, see it not as a threat, and so forth. The good news is, one thing I will say that is important, even in the United States where we have this most organized negative agenda, very well funded, by the way, by 2 billionaires, by the Koch brothers. The broad public, which is never talked to about these issues, is by and large not the problem. Because if you look at opinion surveys, 65 or 70% of Americans generally agree on the right things. And 60% are against Trump, and maybe 35% support Trump. So don't think that that's also a popular phenomenon or a reflection of American popular mood. It's a reflection of power and organization, not a reflection of any kind of different consensus. So I don't think that people are against this viscerally that it's overcoming powerful negative forces. I think people don't know. They're worried, they're preoccupied, they're distracted, they don't have engagement, they don't know who to ask, and they hear a lot of propaganda every day, day in, day out, which is directed propaganda, not random propaganda. It's propaganda by vested interests. And the whole market economy is based on the propaganda of large interests. And so this is a phenomenally central part of what capitalism is excess. And it's excess of the existing. It's not all the future solar producers, they don't have any money. It's all the current oil producers. And so this is a hard part of transformation. On the Convention on Biological Diversity, I believe generally that Ed Wilson's call to protect half Earth is both inspiring, clear, and practicable and achievable. But my question to Ed was, which half? And it's my question to CBD, to the Secretariat, to IUCN, to the scientists, what to protect. IUCN spent 10 years on a ground-up effort of what should we protect. It ended up with a lot of little parks. The parks are not big enough to sustain large land mammals, for example. They're not big enough to save the great apes. They're not big enough to save the orangutans. They're all going to extinction on the current path, would be my assessment. We need much larger protected areas. How? And so I believe a map would be a wonderful thing. And I, again, not sounding crazy naive, but literally, what would a map of which half of the Earth to be protected, and what definitions does protection mean? And with Gilberto and others, we're looking practically at that in a project that we call FABLE, Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use, and Energy, to get an integrated assessment from the land perspective. Should I be farmed? Should I be set aside and protected? Should I be built upon? In other words, from the land's point of view, what is the right way to envision protection? And I was very disheartened with IUCN, by the way, because they made a presentation for us of this 10-year effort, I don't remember exactly what it was called, of identifying the protected areas. And then I asked the question is, when you're an economist, you're allowed to ask naive questions. Because what do you know? You're asking scientists for their answers. So I said, is that really going to protect the species in those areas? No, Mr. Sachs, it won't. Well, why is that your map? Well, because that's what was agreed on, and it's very important to get buy-in. I don't find that a full answer at all. I find the question of what should it be an absolutely proper answer. Now, of course, there could be, the objective function could be many different things, so what should it be is a loaded question. But at least you say what your objectives are, and then you can define the should in an analytical way. And I'd like to see much more research on that. And interestingly, to my experience, the biodiversity community does not speak very much with the agronomists. And the agronomists at their core are, how do we grow more grain? And the biodiversity is, oh my God, they're clearing more land. Rather than, how do we make both goals work? And that's dialogue, really important and very much underplayed. And I would say to you and to colleagues at CBD, biodiversity is the weakest part of this whole agenda in political organization, because the species don't even speak English or Portuguese. Nobody represents them. They have no vote. They're not heard. They don't own shares. Their land claims, they lost title to their land a long time ago. So nobody cares. And it's really important to understand that as the next step. Get tougher fast and go to the places that are ripping up the land. That's mainly the big agriculture, mainly. Also some small, but the big agriculture is the big story. And what are we going to do about that? Where can we draw the line? And Brazil is in the front line of that issue. Absolutely, it's the central issue for this country in important ways because you are the stewards of the Amazon. And so where do you draw the line? Because you could absolutely profitably cut down a heck of a lot more of the Amazon profitably in quotation marks. And of course, it would be devastating for Brazil and for humanity. And so where is the line to be drawn?
Thank you very much for coming. Thanks foremost to Jeff for taking his time in a very difficult situation to give us quite important words of advice. Thank you very much, Jeff.